All right, today is our family fifth. It's no children's church today, but we're going to try to be, I'm not going to say quick or fast because we do have Lord's Supper, so take that into account. But we are going to be interactive, and so I think it'll be good. Kids, this is a story. It's a pretty interesting story. It's one that maybe your parents or adults have no clue what's exactly going on here. It's one of the most confusing stories. And so instead of wondering for 30 years like I did, what in the heck is Jesus doing here? You'll know early. So pay attention. Otherwise, you're going to come back in 30 years and say, I should have listened. What is Jesus doing here? So Mark chapter 7. And I will remind you, last week, so these actually go together, which is too much to cover all together, and this was a perfect children's sermon because it's a cool story. But these actually go together. So I think Mark ties these two events together. So if you remember last week, the story or the point Jesus is making with the Pharisees and his disciples, and that all food is clean, and what defiles a person is what comes out of his heart, not what goes into his mouth and into his stomach. That sort of thing. Now Jesus is going to go demonstrate it. And so he immediately, as Mark says, and there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Jesus is moving into Gentile territory. So he's saying, hey, I'm going to live what I'm speaking. I'm not going to be defiled by being in this place. But what degree, to what level? And so we see this happen. Immediately, a woman came to him. And now I'll tell you a little bit about this woman. We're going to go back in the story. But she was a woman who had a daughter who was unclean, an unclean spirit. And she was in Gentile territory, which is also unclean. And she was a woman speaking to a man in public, which was, if not unclean, it was not appropriate socially. But more than all that, she was a Syrophoenician. She was like the worst of the Gentiles. The people in Tyre and Sidon were rich, and they would take the bread that the Jews worked hard to grow, and they would eat it because they were rich. And I think that's something here with the bread and the scraps. And so Jesus is going to say, let me show you. What's interesting is he seems to act like the Pharisees at the beginning. So you might say, what's going on? But let's get into the story. It says, from there he arose. Oh, and let me tell you real quick. These pictures, and throughout the slides, I've got 4 scenes that we're going to walk through. The kids have been in this story the last month, and they've been drawing pictures for me. And so some of them deal specifically with a scene. There's about 4 kind of main scenes in the story. And then others, and these are why they're not better or anything, but they're kind of the whole story summed up in a picture, so that's how they made the title slide. But you're going to see the different kids. If you're not sure what's on the picture, that's okay, because I wasn't either. I might have put it in the wrong scene a few times, but for the most part, you see the story coming to life in the minds of the children. So that's a little cool addition we had for our family fifth. So go with me, Mark chapter 7, verse 24 and following. It says, he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And so the first scene, as we can go on, is a little game of hide and seek, right? Jesus, I think what he does when he pulls away a lot of times is a desire to teach. He needs to pour into his disciples a little bit. He needs some alone time with them, and so he goes off, and there's nowhere in Jewish territory anymore. After the feeding of 5,000, they can go, so they go into Gentile land, but word travels fast. Especially if you talk about a free lunch, right? Everybody shows up. And so even though he's trying to hide, there's one who's seeking. And that's really the first point as we see, and this has been really, really cool. I have not known this. This is one of those revelations God has given me as I've studied this together. And that's why we do this. If you're tired of Mark, I'm sorry. But I understand that. There are some things, man, I'd love to jump over here to Hebrews or to Romans or to do these other things. But there's also a benefit. Things come to light when you do it together slowly. And so I've actually seen what I didn't realize, and I know where we're going. We're going to blind Bartimaeus. I'll give you a spoiler. He's, I think, the ultimate disciple before Jesus turns to the cross. But he's building these pictures of disciples. We've talked about that. And they're in unlikely places. But we get a little bit more maturity as well. And I didn't know that. I didn't see that. But I'm starting to see it now. That in these pictures, we start to get a little bit more mature disciple. And so this woman, there's a lot of linguistic things I don't have time for. The kids would be bored by if I talk about it. But there's a lot of linguistic ties with this woman and the last woman we met, also in Gentile territory. When she comes and, I think maybe not, I should say that. I think he was getting ready to cross over the ocean. Or he had just come back from the demon-possessed man in Gentile territory. But she reaches and touches his cloak, remember? So these two women are very similar, and she was the ideal disciple in that story. But there's one difference, but we're not there yet. And so I want you to see, though, that the disciples grow. This woman does one thing that the other woman didn't. And then Bartimaeus is going to do something that even this woman doesn't. And so as we're learning, I hope we see the whole narrative together. That God is trying to reproduce the ideal disciple, which ultimately becomes Jesus. He takes that mantle and goes to the cross. But wherever you're at on the line is okay. Maybe, like the woman before, you need to see the miracle and then know what he did. This woman doesn't have to see the miracle. And then so forth. And so I want you to see how the disciples grow in maturity and ask maybe for yourself, where am I, God? Where am I on the spectrum? And how do I get to that next level of faith? But back to the story, the first thing we see, and this is really where the Lord's Supper is going to come into the sermon, is how the woman approaches Jesus. You see, she doesn't ask him to give her an antidote or to tell her what she needs to do. She comes seeking Jesus, desperate. And it says she came and fell down at his feet. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. The first thing we see from a disciple here, from a perfect, ideal disciple as far as the story goes, is one who comes and falls down at the feet of the Lord and says, Lord, I can't do it. I cannot do this. You have to do it. Will you do it? You see, there's a difference between hard and helpless. And sometimes we think we've just got to try real hard. I love, there's a C.S. Lewis quote. It says, one man. But then he gets to chapter 6 and he says this. And your English messes it up just a little bit. It says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? It says, by no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it? But there's actually an article before sin in both of those places. So he doesn't say, shall we continue to sin? He says, shall we continue, and it's a dative, so to's not actually there, so we have to make it fit. Shall we continue in the sin, or to do the sin? Well, which sin, Paul? Aren't they all equally bad? Yeah. But what sin does he have in mind? I think it goes back to the garden. It's trying. It's trying to do it yourself instead of just trusting in God's wisdom. I can eat this myself and turn myself into knowledge apart from God. And so as we come to this table, we have to understand that we don't just die to sin generally. When we eat the bread and when we drink the cup, we're saying, I'm dying to trying. I am helpless. I cannot try and get there. And so when we eat, we eat in faith. We drink in faith, saying, God, you're the only hope I have. And so I'm not coming here making a promise to try harder this week. I'm not making a promise to try to forgive better. I'm coming receiving your help and saying, I can't. And I'm done trying. And instead of asking the question, God, how am I doing? I just bask in his goodness and say, God, how can you be so good? And when I sin, I'll say, okay, God, I'm going to try harder. I say, wow, you still love me. You still want what's best for me. And look what I've just done. Okay, God, I'm not going to try again. I'm dead again. I'm going to die to trying. I'm going to die to the sin. And I'm going to just trust in you. And so as Sheldon plays, and the men get ready, that's the preparation of your heart that I want you to do. You say, God, where am I trying? Where am I trying to earn my own salvation? Where am I trying to gain your love? And let me lay that down at this table and come and just receive all your grace that you freely give me. Our table is open to believers. And so if you have done that, you have to do that first. One time. Say, God, I can't do this. I need you. And that's not what the table's about. This is not a place of salvation. This is a place of remembering. And so we just ask that if you've been saved, and then our first step is baptism. The first time we cry out to him and say, I can't do it, is baptism. And so we tie baptism and the Lord's Supper together. And so if you've been a believer and you've done it that first time in baptism, now you come and you just remember that. And you say, God, I'm still not going to try. God, I'm still going to rely on your blood and your body for not only forgiveness, but for literally every need I have in my life. And when you've done that in your heart, come and do it physically. And so I invite you to come all to the table that have done that as families, but you don't have to, like the dad, come and get it and bring it back. Just everybody come when you're ready. So, and then we'll close in just a minute. that's somewhat intentional. I like to change it up. But if you're waiting, go ahead if you're ready to take it. We're not gonna take it together. I'm already taking mine. But just in your own heart as a prayer. Lord, I trust in you for my salvation, your blood, for forgiveness, and you can take it. Disciples, after you did it for 5,000, when they didn't know exactly what it meant, you did it in an upper room. You said the blood of a covenant. You made a promise to us, and it's a promise you'll keep, because God cannot lie to save us if we trust in you. And then you said, my body broken or given for you. And part of that picture is your love that you freely give. And there's no good gift you reserve for us, as Paul understood that. But I think the other side of that is given for you, because there's no other way for us to get it. There is no other way for us to reach where we need to reach, which is perfection, cleansed to be with our Father who is perfect in heaven. And so you said, I'm doing this for you. And so God, if we start doing it for us too, and we're blasphemers at worst and faithless at best, because we don't really believe you've done it all, and we can live in freedom, not to go back into our sin, but to freely live in righteousness. Because we died to sin. And so now we're actually free to not sin. Not to sin. We were always free to sin, but now we're free not to. And we cannot do that on our own. And so, Lord, I pray that we don't forget that, and we would walk in our weakness before you. In Jesus' name, amen. And so the woman comes as a disciple has to, in desperation. And there's a difference in how you come, and that's why humility matters. When we come in absolute desperation and humility, we don't really have a choice how to respond to Jesus. We take whatever he offers. And so I think as we continue in the story, that's going to shed a little bit of light on what's going on here. So if you haven't read ahead, you're like, what is he even talking about? Why is this a weird story? Well, it's about to happen right here. She begs him to cast the demon out of her daughter, and he says to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Whoa! A little harsh, bro. Jesus, man. You don't have to call her a dog. What's he doing here? I think what he's doing is, if he hadn't just done the other with the Pharisees, we might think, maybe this is just what he's doing, but he has to be doing it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and Mark recognizes it. That's why he puts these together. It's Jesus is the first one that explained that this grace is expansive and inclusive. And it's not children and dogs. It's children, and then the children I haven't got yet, because these children need to go get those children, but they're all my children. And so what is Jesus doing here? I think he's testing her the way he's tested the Pharisees already in this book. He says something that's shocking in order to see how will you respond. And so many times you see this with the Pharisees. He'll say something like that, and they'll say, whoa, you can't say that. Never mind. And he discovers, or he shines a light on a little bit of pride left. But when we're totally humble before the Lord and pride is no more and we come to Him in humility, He can say whatever He wants. He's God. And I'm actually less than a dog. I'm an enemy and an alien. And so her response illustrates, and I think Jesus kind of has a wink and a smile. It's okay, good, she got it. We've made it past the first stage, which is humility and desperation. When you're desperate, the doctor can't offend you by talking about something rough. Some doctors don't have the best bedside manner. And maybe deep in your heart or head, you're like, I can't believe he said it that way. But where else can I go? And so, when you're desperate, you don't consider what they say as potential. It's just, it is. And so there's humility here. And so Jesus is fighting through pride, and he sees. And we see it in her answer, and I love her answer. She says, yes, Lord. Now I'm going to stop there real quick. This really could have gone back to scene 1. She is the only person in all the Gospel of Mark to call Jesus Lord. Now we know the disciples said it because Matthew uses it all the time. And in fact, that's for Matthew the separation. The disciples call him Lord, everybody else calls him teacher. And so if we know they actually did say it, and probably other people said it, just not knowing who he was as the Son of God, but they just say Lord because it just means sir. And so Mark could have put it all sorts of places, and yet he doesn't. And I think the reason for that is he wants us to see that she gets it. Even later, Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Mark leaves out Son of the living God because he understands Peter doesn't know yet what he's saying. And we'll talk about that in another sermon. And so he doesn't put it in there. Just because they say it, if they don't know what they're saying, he doesn't give them credit for it. Mark is just unique that way. And so we cannot miss that she calls him Lord here. He's saying she understands exactly who he is, which is really the key to her response. Yes, Lord. Yet, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he said, for this statement, you may go your way, the demon has left your daughter. So scene 3 is her response. And so what Jesus is doing is he's getting a little bit of a battle of wits. Who goes first, the children or the dogs? And so, let's see if I can illustrate this. I forgot, I had promised Cameron and Ellie if they were good, they would get a peppermint. And so, Dina, have they been pretty good? Okay. So I'm going to come and give y'all peppermints right here in the middle of my sermon. Because why not?
Do we have some peppermints? Yeah, plenty of them.
Are you kidding me?
You have plenty for everyone.
I promised these to my kids, and you want to take these peppermints from them? You want to take these peppermints out of their mouth?
You have plenty of them.
Oh, you weren't talking about these peppermints. You know that I have more than enough for everybody. And in fact, I do have more than enough for everybody. The kids get theirs first, but here, have some crumbs. In fact, anybody that wants a peppermint, I'll let you take those since y'all asked and pass them around while I finish this sermon. Here, take them, Shade, and stand up. And anybody that wants peppermint, raise your hand. And Shade will bring you peppermint. And so kids, I hope you maybe got that illustration a little bit, but that's what I think is going on here. She recognizes something that the Jews and the Pharisees hadn't recognized. You see, for them, it's me or you. Are the promises for us or are they for the Gentiles? Is grace for me or is grace for you? And the Syrophoenician woman says, no, I'm not talking about their grace. I'm talking about the other grace. I don't need to take anything that is theirs. You don't need to change anything about salvation history. You have plenty. Let's see this real quick. Let the children be fed. Is that what your Bible says? Most of you? Does anybody say, let the children be satisfied?
Eat all they want.
Eat all they want. Okay, that's different. Some might say satisfied. That word there is only used 3 other times, but in 2 other stories. It's used twice next. And it's 2 feedings. He feeds the 5,000. We just saw it. And then he's going to feed the 4,000 in Gentile territory, next chapter. And he uses it twice. Eat all they want. After the people were satisfied, after the people ate all they want, and in those stories it's usually interpreted that way, because that's the point. They were stuffed. But here, they just interpreted it fed. But Mark is wanting us to see what was the problem with the disciples. They didn't understand the bread. Remember? It says they were afraid because they didn't understand the loaves. She understood the loaves. The perfect disciple wasn't even there. Didn't have to ask Jesus afterwards, what did this really mean? Explain this to us. She knew. They can eat all they want. And I'll just take the crumbs. Because I know who you are. You are all sufficient. There is no opportunity cost. There is no limited amount of you, of your grace, of your goodness. And so you giving me some doesn't at all take away from anybody else. And I think sometimes we have the other view of God. We don't understand that there really aren't any finite resources of grace, or mercy, or love. And we're scared to ask, man, I've asked so much. And I've been asking for all this grace. Is it wrong to ask for this other thing too? Or, if I get this, what about these other people? And she says, it doesn't matter. God is different than anything here on this earth. With anything earthly, if I have it, you don't. Now, there might be more, as in the peppermints, but nobody got the same peppermint. But with God, it is not so. He is a fountain overflowing. And so kids, when you come to God and you wonder, is this too small or too big, or it doesn't matter. He will never run out. And He will never even have less. You know that? When God gives you something, He has no less of it. There's more in the world. If more people asked for grace, there would be actually more grace, but never less. I don't know how that works in math, but it works in God. That's what she's saying here. She's saying, the cool thing about the dogs, and I love that she gets into this battle of wits and she takes it and uses it, because the next kids don't get fed at the same time, but the dogs actually get fed at the same time. She said, no, I'm not talking about the food that you're going to take off the table and give to the dogs after they eat. I just want just a crumb, because a crumb from you is plenty. And the dogs even get crumbs from the kids, right? We'll just hang out under the table. I'm just hanging out under the table, Jesus. I'm not stopping you. I'm not asking you to come give it to the Gentiles instead of the Jews. But I know all you got to do is just say it. And while you're still walking to wherever you were going, you don't have to stop. You don't have to turn around. Just say it. And he says, you're right. You figured it out. You cracked the puzzle. I am enough. You know my name. Remember we talked about this. He is. The point of Yahweh is that everything you need, He is, and more. And He says, you know my name. The Jews haven't figured out my name yet. And yet you call me Lord. And you tell me all I need is crumbs. The disciples say, Lord, we don't have enough. Do you know how much it would take to feed these people? And you say, I'll just take crumbs. That's what a disciple does. It understands that Jesus is enough for everything they need. They don't have to just come to Him for spiritual things, but then go through hard work. They're pulling up their bootstraps and working hard, earn the other stuff. He's everything. He's all we need. She remembers the loaves. She does what the disciples don't do. She understood the parable. She understood the parable of the dogs and the children. so well that she was able to use it, in a sense, against Jesus, but use it back and say, no, we'll stick with what you said. And therefore, so she understands the parables. She understood and remembered the loaves. Do you see what she's doing? She's the ideal disciple. She's everything the disciples aren't. She didn't have to say, explain this parable to me. She actually applies the parable to her own life. Then the last thing a disciple does, she obeys without proof. And this is where she actually has matured more than the last woman. Again, I'm not saying she was more mature than the last woman. Mark is creating this. And so we have to leave the historical and come into the narrative. But as I'm looking at this and saying, okay, I'm like this woman. I want to be like this woman, that I just reach out for Jesus. But if you remember that woman, it says specifically, when she perceived, when she felt in her body that she had been healed, she confessed and said, it was me. This woman has zero proof. Now, some of you say, well, she couldn't possibly have proof, and I would agree with that. I mean, the daughter's not with her. But what do the disciples do? What do others do? Say, how can we know? And so maybe she doesn't ask for proof. Maybe she doesn't say, Jesus, you have to come with me, but, okay, how can I know that this worked? Can I have a sign at least? What sign will you give me that when I go home, I don't have to go home in fear, but I can actually, the walk itself can be peaceful because I'm not still wondering what I'm finding at home. There are immature disciples, even mature disciples, in this room and elsewhere, where we still need that, Lord. I know your promises, but I still don't have peace about them. I have hope. I know you can do it, but I don't have peace. Can I have a sign? Can somebody speak something, or can I see something in your word? And I'm going to open it, and if you show me this word, I'll know you've done it. And that's okay. Listen, God loves you, and He wants to and He'll give you that oftentimes because He meets us where we're at. But He wants you to get to the place where you don't need to ask for that. You just know, God, if this is good and if this is your will, it's done. And so I can celebrate my daughter's healing before I see my daughter's healing. And so that's what she does. She does what a disciple does. She does what Jesus' disciples have yet to do. And that is go at His word. Don't ask questions. Don't ask for clarification. Don't try to change it. It says she went home. And then the narrative finishes. She's not surprised, but the narrative just tells her, here's what she found. Jesus says, for this statement, go your way, the demon has left your child, your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying in the bed and the demon gone. May we be like her, who come to Jesus in absolute desperation and humility. We don't just come desperate saying, God, I can't do it, but you still have to do it in these ways, or I will be offended. I won't follow you if you still do these things. I won't follow you if you still judge this sin or these people, and we begin to tell God who He can be. That doesn't mean we're not desperate, but it does mean we're not humble. And so we come to Him both desperately saying, I can't do it, and humbly saying, and whoever you are, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. God, I don't know exactly who you are yet. But whoever you are, as you are, I'm not going to change you. I just need to know who you are so I can follow you. Because whatever you are is right and good, even if I don't see it or understand it right now. So I come humbly. And then I come with an awareness of God. God, you are enough. Your grace is expansive. It's not just for the Jews, it's for every single person, no matter who we are, no matter what our background is, and it's enough. It's all I need. I just need crumbs. The beautiful thing about the gospel is that we do just need crumbs. All we need is the most minute, if you could even make it finite, but you can't, amount of grace to be enough. And yet, Jesus gave his whole life. Why do you think he did that? Why do you think he gave his whole life? God sent his very own Son. Is it because he couldn't have come up with some other scheme that an offense against God could have been forgiven? I don't think so. I think God could have done whatever he wanted. He could have just kept it doves and sheep and goats. I don't think he was bound by that. He bound himself by that. Why? To demonstrate his love for us. Not sufficiency. But God sent his own Son to demonstrate his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I want you to contrast or keep those two things in balance. He could have done less. Not in this world, because he created the world and the dynamics of the world as it was. But he could have created something different. But he didn't, so that he would have to send his own Son, so that we would have to know how much he loves us. It's a little bit heady for a kid's sermon, I understand. But you have to see, he went over and above. He didn't give you crumbs. Not because he couldn't, but because he wants you to know, I love you this much. And if I just gave you crumbs, you may not actually know how much I love you. Because you kind of are ants. You kind of are dogs in comparison. You could be nothing. You were made from nothing. And if I just decided you weren't anything, you would do nothing again. But I don't want you to think that way. So you need to know that even though you are literally nothing, to me you are everything. You are worth it. From Jesus' vantage point, to go to the cross for the joy set before him. That was your salvation. And from God's vantage point, to send forth his own Son to shed his blood for you. You are not nothing in God's view. You are his beautiful, beloved child, and he doesn't give crumbs to you, even though he could. So ask for big things and trust in his love.